Hey guys, we are kicking it old school today with a tag video. I saw a super fun tag from Chic Geek. This is the eyeshadow palette tag 5000 is what she calls it. And I also saw another one of my faves, Angelica Nyqvist, do this video, so I wanted to hop on board. I just love a good tag video. They always bring me back to the early days of YouTube, back when tags were super popular. And I just love any video pertaining to eyeshadow palettes, so when I saw this tag, I knew I was going to film it. I'll go ahead and link Chic Geek's video down below, her original version of this video, and if you have a channel or you make videos online and you want to do your version of this tag, then I absolutely tag you to do it as well. So let's go ahead and get into the questions. I thought these were such a fun set of questions. So the first question is a palette that you wore to a special occasion. The last special occasion I can remember going to was my good friend's wedding last summer. I was a bridesmaid in her wedding, and I also did her makeup, the bride's makeup, and I used these two palettes for both of our eye looks. I used the Urban Decay Mini Naked Sin palette and one of my favorites, the Flower Desert Lights palette. Anytime I have a special occasion, I'm probably going to be reaching for the Flower Desert Lights palette because this just has so many of my favorite shimmers and they all look so just dimensional and sparkly. They're all super foiled, and I also just feel like these shadows give really high-end vibes. And for just a few other basic shades, I pulled in the Urban Decay Naked Sin. This is just a super simple rosy palette. I really don't think it's anything that special. Like, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you run out and buy this palette, but I actually find it really useful. I really like this matte shade right here. It's actually, the shade is called Boring, and I would have to say that that is, funnily enough, my favorite shade in this palette. It's just the perfect transition shade, and it pairs so well with any of the shimmers in the Flower palette. I think these two palettes make such a pretty pair for a soft, rosy, glam look, and I do actually have a tutorial on my channel of that look that I did, so I can link that below if you're interested. The next question is a palette that you love but is repetitive, and I know just the answer for this one. That would have to be my Sigma Ambiance palette. When this palette first came out, I actually thought to myself, you know, that looks way too repetitive. I don't understand why they need to have so many similar brown shades in one palette. But now I kind of get it, and I don't mind that this palette in particular is repetitive. I usually don't like, especially when a palette is really big and it has a ton of overlapping shades, that gets on my nerves. But this palette clearly is just dedicated to warm brown shades. Like, that is just what this palette is all about. And for a palette like this, I think it kind of makes sense to have a few sort of repetitive shades. Like, these two shades here look really similar to each other, but one is a lot warmer toned than the other, has a lot more of like an orangey undertone to it. And same with these two. This one has more red to it, this one's a bit more orangey. So I kind of like that this palette is repetitive. Normally I don't care for super repetitive palettes, but I think in this case it kind of makes sense because you can really be super specific about which undertone you're going for, and you also know that all the shades are going to work well together. So even though normally I don't like really repetitive palettes, with this one I actually really enjoy how repetitive it is because I think, you know, if I'm in the mood for a warm brown palette, I know that this palette is going to have everything I need. Next we have a palette that you got your money's worth, and for me that would have to be my Anastasia Norvina palette. I mean, just looking at this palette, I definitely have gotten my money's worth out of it. I think pretty soon it's going to be time to retire this one. I'll probably put it in my little keepsake bin of like expired makeup that I don't really want to fully let go of, because this is just such an iconic palette for me. It's been one of my favorites for such a long time. I still love this color story so much. I've hit pan in so many of the shades, more than half of the shades I've hit pan on, and that is more pans than any other palette in my collection. So this one I have definitely gotten my money's worth. I remember I bought this right when it came out, and that at the time for me, I think that was in 2018. At the time that was so rare for me. Like, I would hardly ever buy a palette on launch day, but this one I bought right away. And I remember at first I didn't love this palette, but it really started to grow on me the longer I used it, and it's been one of my all-time favorite palettes for a few years now. I still love it so much. Next one is a palette that is an awesome deal. I would have to go with my Wet n Wild Color Icon 10 pan in the shade Call Me Sunshine. I think I saw in Chic Geek's video, her answer for this one was another one of the Wet n Wild 10 pan palettes. Wet n Wild just does eyeshadows so well. They have for years. I still think they are one of the best eyeshadow brands at the drugstore. This palette is under $5 if I remember correctly. I think it's like $4.98 or something like that. To me, this palette absolutely beats the Urban Decay Naked Honey palette, which I used to have, and I decluttered it because I just wasn't really using it. It's definitely not like a shade for shade dupe of that palette, but it has a very similar vibe. To me, this one is better though. I just think the shades are a bit more interesting, and I really love, there's one shade in particular in here I think is like the star of the show. This shade right here, it is this beautiful, twinkly, sparkly duochrome shade. It has such a high-end look to it. Like, it has a very three-dimensional sparkle to it, and I like that it's kind of translucent. I feel like that gives it an even more expensive look. Like, just the fact that the base is kind of sheer. So, so pretty. So to me, I mean, that, I feel like that shade is worth $5 by itself, but I just think this is such a great palette for those honey mustard type of shades. I just think it's so much fun. Great for the summertime especially. I also love this shade down here for a one shadow look. Really interesting bronze shade that almost has like a purpley taupe shift to it. Just some really unique shades in this palette. Some great basics, but also some fun, like actually interesting, unique shadows that you just would not expect out of a $5 palette. So I think this is an incredible deal. A quad that you love and wish was a larger palette. This was tough. I only have a handful of quads, and really all of them, I like them just the way they are. But the one that I think would be really fun if it were expanded into a larger palette would be the Hard Candy Buzz quad. This is such a fun quad. I've always wanted a monochromatic yellow palette, like a full yellow palette. For a long time I was really debating buying the ColourPop Honey palette, but I never did because it has a pressed glitter in it, and I know I won't use that shade, so I just would rather not buy a palette if I know there's a shade I'm not going to use. So I never got around to buying that one, but really this quad has satisfied my itch for yellow shadows. The matte yellow in here is phenomenal. It actually like shows up true to color on the eyes. You don't have to keep layering it on. It doesn't go on chalky, which to me is really impressive for like a $4 quad. I think that's really, really impressive. Among the Hard Candy Moods quads, I actually think there are more misses than hits, but this is one of the hits. This is actually a really good quad. So if they ever came out with like a 12-pan version of this, I would be really excited. Then again, I really don't need a larger yellow palette. In fact, in my collection, I actually have a palette that sort of looks like a larger version of this Hard Candy quad, and it's the Ace Beauté Flora palette. This one is more of a full-sized palette, has more yellows in it, but I also like that it has some oranges and reds. I think that adds a fun pop. The next question we have is a palette that you love the quality but hate the packaging. So for this one, I went with one of my favorites in my collection. This is the Clarity So Mermazing palette. I love this palette so much. It has so many of my favorite shades in it, especially the shimmers are just to die for. But I don't like how big the pans are. The pans in here are huge. They're so big. This is a 10-pan palette, but let me actually compare it to another one of my 10-pan palettes for you real quick, just to show how laughably gigantic it is. So this is the ColourPop Sweet as Can Be palette, another 10-pan. This is the Clarity palette. Like, come on now. It did not need to be this big. But actually, I bring this up because I saw that Clarity actually has gotten rid of the big pans in their palettes, I think, or they're phasing them out. And the So Mermazing palette is now smaller with square pans. So I kind of am wishing I had that version now. I mean, I'm not going to buy that just to replace this. I think that would be kind of a waste. But if you have been holding off on buying this palette due to the size, I thought I would point that out because they now do make it in a smaller size. So yeah, I'm always kind of annoyed by just how much space this palette takes up when it only has 10 shades in it, but I also love it so much that I'm willing to forgive. And aside from that, I think the packaging is beautiful. Like, I love the mermaid scales on here. I think that's so fun. This next question, I spent so long coming up with my answer for this one, but this is show your dream palette with singles. So I went through all my singles. I actually took out all of even my depotted shadows from my BH Cosmetics Lost in Los Angeles palette, my Lethal Cosmetics shadows. I rounded them all up and put together just the ones that I thought would make like my perfect palette. And here's what I came up with. You ready? So it's quite a mix, and they're all different sizes, so it was kind of hard to make it look pretty, but I took out a few of my Lethal Cosmetics shadows. I thought about just having my answer be my custom Lethal palette, but I made that palette about a year ago, or a little less than a year ago, and if I were to do it again, I would change a few things, or I would replace a few of the shades, so I only pulled out a few of the shades from that palette. So let me just walk you through all the shades in here. So these top three right here are depotted from my Shared Planet Polar Bear palette. We have this fun icy duochrome shade. It has a blue shift. I thought that would make a fun inner corner highlight. I gotta have an inner corner highlight in my dream palette. So that would be that one. Also from that palette, this matte rosy taupe shade. I love that color. I love that type of shade to just start out any look. And I also think that type of shade makes a great transition shade for colorful looks. And as you can see, I have quite a few colorful shadows in here, but I like that it brings in a bit of that rosiness that I have in my skin tone. So it helps really any color blend into my skin tone nicely. So I just think that type of shade is so useful. Had to include it in here. This blue shimmer here is also from the Shared Planet palette. This is just such a pretty like blue and purple duochrome shade. These slightly larger squares over here are all from Lethal Cosmetics. These two are both multi-chromes. I have Parsec and Genesis. And then of course I had to include a yellow. This is the shade Daybreak from Lethal, and then this Periwinkle shade is Altitude. And then I also went ahead and put in this deeper mauve shade. That's the shade Imago. That's really the only deep shade in this palette. I think if I were putting together my dream palette, I might have a couple other deep shades just for some depth and some contrast, but you know, at the same time, I don't always feel the need to have like a deep shade in my eye look, so I think I would be fine with just these. Then I also included this single down here from ColourPop. That's the shade Snake Eyes, one of my favorite one and done shadows. A couple of peach colors. This little guy here is from the ColourPop Miss Bliss palette. I believe that was the shade Vibrant Thing, if I can remember correctly. I love that color. Such a pretty dusty peach. And then this lighter peachy golden shimmer is from the BH Cosmetics Lost in Los Angeles palette. Another couple from the BH Lost in Los Angeles palette, that cool lilac pink shade, and then this really pretty mint green. I also threw in another ColourPop single, this mint green here. That's the shade La Playa. Also makes a really pretty inner corner highlight. I thought that would go nicely with some of these other greens. And then these two big pans are from Clarity. I've got this really fun lime green foiled shade. That's the shade Capri Sun. And then this one down here is another one of my favorite duochromes. It shifts from like a gray to gold, which I just think is so pretty and unique. And that's the shade Smoking Mirrors from Clarity. So those are the shades I picked out from my singles collection to make my dream palette. I don't have the biggest singles collection ever. I definitely don't have very many neutral shades in my singles. So I think I might have like a few more neutral shadows in here if I were really putting together like my dream perfect palette. But I really like this combo of shades together, and I do think it feels very me. A lot of like pastels and like soft muted colors, which is really my favorite. Like I like colorful shadow, but usually when I'm playing with colors, I'm sticking to more muted or pastel shades. So I think this is a really fun little mix of shades. Ooh, okay, I like that arrangement better. I put the two Clarity shades down here, but I think I'm gonna keep these shades in here and actually maybe create some looks with this palette, because I had a lot of fun picking out the shades. It took me a while. I was like debating so many different ones, but this is what I ended up with. So yeah, that was actually probably my favorite question in this whole tag, because it really got me thinking. Next up, palettes you like to combine together. So for this one, I decided to go with all three of my BH Cosmetics palettes. I have Summer in Saint-Tropez, Mimosa, and Lost in Los Angeles, which I'm just gonna go ahead and put all three of them on the screen side by side so that you can see them all together. My Lost in Los Angeles shades, as you saw, they're depotted and they're also currently all dispersed differently, so I don't have those all together right now, but I think these three palettes are so much fun. In fact, I did a palette bingo using all three of these palettes for my patrons and members like a few months back, and the look ended up so fun, so cohesive. Really, like, these three palettes are my best colorful eyeshadow palettes. These really bring a lot of those colors that I don't have a whole lot of elsewhere in my collection. And I especially think with the Lost in Los Angeles palette, that palette to me really is a companion palette. You can definitely create a look with any of these three palettes by themselves, but I think especially with Lost in Los Angeles, that one is mostly mid-toned and pastel colors, and sometimes I want to bring in some deeper shades or some brighter shades or just some neutrals. So I think especially Summer in Saint-Tropez and Lost in LA, I think those two especially make a great combo because Saint-Tropez does have some deeper and like richer colorful shadows, and it also has some really good basic neutral shades, including one of my favorite types of shades, a rosy taupe color. And then Mimosa brings a lot of fun like hot pinks and corals. I also love the yellow and the orange in here. So I think really just those three palettes, I know they weren't necessarily meant to be all together. Those three I think are some of the best palettes for mixing and matching and combining shades in my collection. Next up, we have large palette that you wish was smaller. I'm actually gonna go with a palette that I decluttered earlier this year, the Ace Beauté Floral Vintage palette. That palette, really the whole reason I got rid of it was just because it was too big and I felt like it was too repetitive. And a great example of a palette also that just had too many overlapping shades and it really could have been condensed into something more practical for me. And I don't really have a lot of large palettes in my collection for that reason. I feel like, you know, they're always so unwieldy. They take up so much space in my drawers. I don't necessarily have a great place to put them because they don't fit with my other palettes. And 9 times out of 10, if a palette has more than 16 shades, to me, it's too many shades. Like, you gotta narrow it down. Cut some of those out because you don't need all of those in one palette, in my opinion. But I loved the color story of that palette. I thought it was such a great concept for a palette just based on different colors of flowers. I liked that it had some pops of green, some peaches, some plummy shades. It just had a little bit of everything. Like, I think if they would have just removed some of those mid-toned orangey brown matte shades in that palette, it would have been perfect. Like, if they had just condensed it down to maybe 16 pans, I probably would still have that palette because I really liked everything about it other than how big it was. The last question, this was a really tough one for me. This is eyeshadow palette that you wish had a matching face palette. So you guys know I'm really not into face palettes. In fact, I don't have any face palettes right now. I don't really buy them because I just prefer single face products. But if there were a brand that could get me to buy a face palette, it would probably be from Flower Beauty, and it would be in the same formula as their Desert and Jungle Lights palettes. I think if they were to come out with a lights face palette, I would throw all logic out the window and I would buy that palette right away, even though I know I'm not a face palette person, because I love this formula so much and I'm so loyal at this point to the Flower Lights formula that if they came out with a lights face palette, I would buy it right away. Wouldn't it be so fun if they did like a blush and highlight palette in this same type of format? I mean, the pans are already a good size for cheek products because they're pretty big. And I think it would even be cool if some of the blushes were matte. Like, I would be really interested to see what a matte shade in this type of formula would be like. It would probably be similar to a ColourPop Super Shock blush, like that sort of bouncy putty like texture. So I'm not saying they should come out with a face palette, but if they did, I would probably buy it. And that's probably the only face palette I would ever buy. So those are all of the tag questions. This is a really fun one, and I'm excited now to use this custom palette that I made. I'll have to do some looks with this. I might post like a YouTube short doing a look with this little custom palette, so stay tuned for that. I'll try to have that up like next week. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. Thank you, Chic Geek, for the awesome questions. I had so much fun with this tag. And like I said, if you have a channel or you make videos online, or if you just want to answer the questions down in the comments below, go ahead. Do it. Thank you guys so much for hanging out today. I hope you had fun. If you did, be sure to give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I do also have a Patreon and a channel membership if you would like to support my channel further. Otherwise, I hope you all have an amazing rest of your day, and I will talk to you again very soon in my next video. Bye!